Hello and welcome to the next installment of 32 Jackpot Marketing Secrets of History's Greatest and Craziest Persuaders with David Lowenthal. I'm David Lowenthal. And today we're going to talk about Chapter 7 in the series, which is called How a Right-Wing Copywriter with Terrible People Skills Got Ronald Reagan elected president in the greatest landslide in American history. And I'm only being a little bit hyperbolic there, but really, if you know the history of the conservative movement in the United States, you know that the person who really got it off the ground financially is a copywriter by the name of Richard Viguerie. In fact, he was so important that he's ultimately called the funding father rather than founding father, but the funding father of the American conservative movement, because conservatives had a lot of ideas at the time, a lot of good ideas that were not being taken seriously by the mainstream media, which then, as of now, were dominated by liberals and progressives and left-wing people. It had no inkling, no understanding of conservatism. However, those people didn't have a lot of organizational skills, but one who did was a guy by the aforementioned Richard Viguerie, who was instrumental in creating the first real donor lists of the movement that could then be shared and sold to and rented to other conservative organizations. And primarily what I want to talk about is a specific event in American political history that allowed him to do this. And the reason I'm going to be talking about this is because it's important to be able to seize opportunity, and because this is an excellent example of somebody seeing an opportunity that is not being seized upon by other people. Now, Viguerie talks about this in his book, America's Right Turn, which, if you're into politics or into copywriting and direct marketing or political fundraising, marketing, and copywriting, totally recommend getting this book called America's Right Turn. I think it came out in like 2004, but a lot of it holds up really great, and it tells you the history of like how you really build a movement. Anyway, so it's 1964. Republicans nominate the very conservative Senator Barry Goldwater to lead their party in the presidential election, which was totally, nobody saw coming. This was a time where you had the so-called Rockefeller Republicans. These were liberal, big government Republicans who were basically, to quote the libertarian media figure and author Michael Malice, they were progressives going the speed limit. They had no interest in limited government or free markets, federalism, capitalism, nothing like that. They just wanted, they believed in the fusion of big business and big government. Until this guy, Barry Goldwater, a conservative senator, comes along, runs, wins in an upset victory against Nelson Rockefeller, who's the governor of New York, total big government guy, passed a lot of horrible drug laws, tax increases, new programs, terrible. Barry Goldwater wins in an upset of the establishment, and instead, what really happened after that is he goes down in a terrible, terrible loss. Basically, against the incumbent president, Lyndon Johnson, goes down in an awful, terrible loss, one of the great landslide losses in American history. However, Richard Viguerie, who was very young at the time and had just started organizing conservative donors, realized that because Barry Goldwater even got the nomination ahead of like all the other more moderate and liberal Republican, left-wing Republican candidates, Viguerie realized that there were massive disaffected conservative voters and donors in society that weren't being talked to. And so after the campaign, what he did was, in those days, everybody who gave a donation of more than, I think it was $50 or $100 or whatever, every name was recorded in the House of Representatives registrar's office. And anybody could go down. It wasn't advertised, but there was no law against going down to the registrar's office and looking at all those names. And so what he did is he would go down and looked at the Goldwater campaign's donor names, because the Goldwater campaign, they were total amateurs. Nobody was collecting these names. No one was kind of monetizing these names in order to create a larger conservative movement. And so what Viguerie did, in a great insight, is he went down to the registrar's office and actually physically wrote down all the names and addresses and mailing addresses, as much as he could every day for weeks. And eventually he hired a bunch of women on his staff to go down and do it for him. And they did it. Now, eventually, the security officer said, okay, you guys are spending way too much time here. You can't be doing this anymore. But the quote-unquote damage was already done. He already got 12 or 13,000, I think, of 15,000 names. So way more than 2/3 of it. Plenty to start a campaign. And it was through that he built his first marketing organization and rented his list of conservative donors to all these other organizations, which were then able to create their own lists and do the same thing and replicate the same process over and over again. So and eventually in 1980 you get Ronald Reagan elected as president, which I don't believe could have happened unless you had this initial fundraising model, because big business and big labor and big media and the big Democratic Party and Wall Street were not in favor of conservatives at this point. Not at all. It was entirely built, almost entirely, on a small donor basis. And so, but he couldn't have done that unless he took the initiative. So this is all a lesson to say that you should always take initiative in looking for opportunity where nobody is looking. I think you can make a safe bet that the conservative movement, whether you love it, whether you hate it, would never have happened if, for not, Richard Viguerie was there. If he wasn't there, it could not have happened. And so that's just a lesson in your own nonprofit, if your own fundraising, or in your own business, that you should always be looking for untapped marketplaces that are not being served. And so I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. Tune in next time for the next lesson. This is David Lowenthal.